Okay, so yeah, today will be mostly anatomy, so structures of the heart, and then some microanatomy as well, histology, and then we'll move into some more physiology later this week. So, as any time when we move into a new system, I like to kind of remind us of what we've talked about, remind us of how this fits in with the whole big picture of anatomy and physiology. So we started out with the cellular stuff, right? Started out with chemical stuff really before that. We started out with cells, and we went to histology. We did the whole musculoskeletal system last semester. We talked about metabolism, how cells need to make energy. They need oxygen for that, right? We talked about the nervous system. We just finished that up. Endocrine system. We just finished that up. A little bit of reproductive. And all of these things can't survive without one thing. What would that one thing be? ATP, that wasn't what you were thinking, but oxygen is what you were thinking, right? And so to make ATP, we need oxygen. There you go. And to move oxygen around the body, we need the cardiovascular system, right? And so that's going to be its primary function, is getting oxygen around the body, but that's not its only function. And we'll talk more about its functions in a bit. But yeah, all of these tissues functioning and working depend on having energy, right? And we make that energy primarily with the use of oxygen. Okay, some other fun facts about the heart. The heart is really, truly an incredible pump, right? This thing is pumping all the time, our whole lives, right? It's this little pump that never gives up, right? Until the end, until we give up, right? And it pumps about 1 to 7 gallons per minute, depending on whether we're exercising or not, and the size of our heart, which on average equals out to be about 2,000 gallons of blood per day. Okay. If we took that and expanded that over the average lifespan, that would fill 1 million barrels of blood. So if we're taking like 55-gallon jugs like this, like they transport oil in, be 1 million of those that we could pump, our little hearts pump in our lifetime. And that's actually enough to fill 2 super tankers of oil, which are the size of the Sears Tower building in Chicago. Right? And so that's an incredible amount of fluid that these little tiny organs inside of our chest can move around in the span of our life, right? So it really is a truly incredible little pump inside of us that works really hard for us. So, okay, so the location of kind of where the heart hangs inside of our body, right? So it's right in the middle of the thoracic cavity, even though most of the time we put our hand over our left side when we put our hand over our heart, right? And that's really just because the left ventricle is so much bigger than the right ventricle, right? But it really does hang in the center there, and the left side is just bigger, so it just sticks over that way. The lungs pretty much push up right next to it, right? So you see we're kind of having to peel the lungs back to even see the sides of the heart. So they're just right next to the heart. Um, and then the bottom of it sits directly on the diaphragm. Diaphragm is just actually interwoven with some of the connective tissue on the outside of the heart. Lots of protection there. Some of our thoracic organs that are all protected nicely by bones, right? Our sternum, our ribs, all of that, all the cartilage in there. But then we also have a pericardium. And so this is a 2-layered membrane that surrounds our heart. It falls in the class of serous membranes, which we've talked about before. And it has 2 layers to it. So we have this very thick, tough, fibrous layer, which gives the heart some protection, and it anchors it to the tissues around. And then the serous part of this other membrane, that has 2 separate layers itself. So 2 little layers with a fluid-filled cavity between those. And we'll see what that looks like here in a sec. So the epicardium is one of these membrane layers, okay? And so this is the heart side of the pericardium. You'll see all of these in an image in a second to help you make it make sense. But the pericardium is that 2-layered membrane that we're talking about. And inside, between those 2 layers, is what's called the pericardial cavity. And this is that fluid-filled space. And so sometimes that space can get infected and inflamed, and that's known as pericarditis. When someone gets pericarditis, the fluid expands in that chamber or in that little space around the heart, and it can start smashing down on the heart, right? And that can lead to what's called cardiac tamponade, which is a life-threatening condition that makes it so your heart can't really beat anymore because it's being smashed down by that extra fluid and that pressure. Okay, and so the kind of life-saving measure that's taken to deal with that is actually stick a needle in the chest and suck that fluid out, right? And that's really what's going on right here, right? Before the invention of ultrasound and guided injections, you got to know your anatomy pretty well to know where you're sticking that needle, right? But now they use an ultrasound machine, so you can see exactly where it's at. Still, you got to know your anatomy well too. But yeah, it's a little bit easier now with the ultrasound. But it's not like it's just a static thing either. The heart's pumping like crazy and moving around as you're sticking the sharp thing inside of it, right? And hopefully not inside of it, but hopefully just outside of it, where that layer is, right? But yeah, that's pericarditis. Pericarditis is um, it can be caused in rare situations by just the common cold. You get a virus and it for some reason makes its way into that part of your body and gets inflamed. Can be caused by other things as well. But yeah, questions or comments about that at all? Yeah, Kate. Yeah, so pretty much that is the heart is, so we have that pressure kind of pushing down on the heart because of that extra fluid in that space. And the heart is just pretty much struggling against that pressure, right? So it's like pushing against it, trying to expand so it can fill with blood, but it can't really. And so the heart's just kind of getting smashed pretty much is what it is. And so you're eventually the cardiac output is just dropping and dropping, just can't really get much blood out of your heart anymore. That's really what that is. Yeah. Other questions on that? Okay, so these are the layers of the heart, right? So this is our most external layer, the epicardium. The middle layer is the muscle, okay? So the myocardium. And then the most internal layer is called the endocardium. And this is pretty much the part that's right in contact with the blood on the inside of the heart. And this is just one thin layer of cells, an epithelial tissue layer. Okay, so take a sec with the people on your team. Turn around if you're in the front, work with your people on your team and fill in these structures here. And then you can answer this question on your clickers right here. Okay, go ahead.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You said that this was the external, middle, and then internal,
Mhm.
but I'm a little bit confused on like where's the pericardium?
Yeah, so the pericardium is made up of two layers here. So when you look at this, so the pericardium is just the fibrous part there. And then the epicardium is this two layers here before you get to the muscle.
Oh,
So yeah, there's really, the pericardium also actually includes this external layer of the epicardium. So,
okay.
yeah, we'll get to it. You'll see it when we uncover it. But yeah, the pericardium really includes the fibrous pericardium and the serous pericardium, which are those two members.
So
those
these
two
are
layers.
like the two layers.
Yeah,
Oh,
but then these are the two layers of the serous part and the cavities in the middle. Yeah, it's complicated. Yeah. Yeah. Pericardium is what includes all of this, all of these membranes. There's really like three layers of membrane that make up the pericardium. Yeah.
Which just fibrous and It's like. Oh.
All right, so go ahead and make sure you're sending that in on your clickers there. Since F is an option, then it's got to be the type of question where you have to hit send. So make sure you hit the send button on your clicker. All right, I got 43. Anybody else out there? Need to hit send. 44, 46. There we go. That's getting closer. Okay. So yeah, the vast majority of you, 96%, are saying C is the place where the fluid would build up during pericarditis, and that's correct. So the whole thing about the pericardium is kind of confusing, right? This kind of hierarchy of the bullet points helps you with it, right? Because the pericardium contains both the fibrous pericardium and the serous pericardium. And the serous pericardium has 2 layers. Fibrous pericardium has 1 layer. So it means really the pericardium has 3 separate layers to it, right? So one with the very external one is the fibrous part of that, right? So it's showing the pericardium. Myocardium is that muscle, right? So the fibrous pericardium is the very external layer that helps anchor the heart and give it a strong protection. B is part of that serous pericardium, but anytime we have a serous membrane, it has 2 layers to it. And the 2 layers are the parietal layer and the visceral layer. Anytime we have a serous membrane, it's going to have those 2 layers. The one that's further away from the organ that it's surrounding is always called the parietal. The one that's closer to the organ that it's surrounding is called the visceral. Okay, so we got the parietal layer of the serous pericardium. We got the cavity in the middle where you guys said the fluid builds up, right? And then D would be the visceral layer of the serous pericardium, which is also known as the epicardium. So lots of confusing words for sure. Okay, so we got pericardium here, fibrous pericardium, serous pericardium, okay? And then the visceral layer of the serous pericardium is also known as the epicardium. Anatomists just had to make it confusing for everybody some way, but you see there are really different distinct layers that needed different names, right? So okay, and then E is the muscle layer, right? So this is the myocardium. And then finally F, this is where the blood itself would be, the heart's pumping, right? And that is the endocardium there, that single layer of cells that kind of lines the inside of the heart. Okay, questions on that? Yeah, go ahead, Sarah. The epicardium. Yeah. Yeah, the visceral layer of the serous pericardium is definitely maybe more of like the way an anatomy person would say it, but like a clinical person would probably say the epicardium. Yeah, good question. Other questions on that? Go ahead. Absolutely, yeah. For sure. Yeah. So anytime we see itis, we're just talking about inflammation. And then it's typically going to be the beginning part of that is going to be what tissue it is that's inflamed, right? So that's it. Yeah. Good question. Other questions? Okay. All right. So let's talk about the chambers. You guys have been studying these in the lab. So So you know these well, right? So we've got the atrium, which would be singular, atria would be plural. These are known as receiving chambers, okay? There's a septum that separates the right and the left, right? The intraatrial septum. Foramen ovale. Foramen ovale is a hole between the right and left atrium in that septum. And this is one way that blood skips the lungs in fetuses, right? Because in when the baby's still in mom's womb, the lungs obviously aren't filling with air. They're getting oxygenated blood already from mom, right? And so that their heart doesn't necessarily have to pump that blood over to their lungs. So it can go right from the right atrium through this little hole, foramen ovale, to the left atrium, down the left ventricle, and then out the aorta, right? Because it's already oxygenated, right? That's one way. There's multiple ways that the blood skips the lungs, but that's one of the ways. And sometimes this doesn't close all the way in people. And later in life, that can lead to some problems, right? Because they have some deoxygenated blood kind of getting put back into general circulation because some of it's skipping the lungs. Yeah, December? Say it again. Atrial what? Oh yeah, so interatrial. Yeah, I know it looks like a lot of letters there smashed together for sure, but yeah, it's interatrial septum, right? So it's just like the dividing tissue between the two atria, between the right and the left atria. It's just the wall between the two. Yeah. Yeah, that's good. And then we got the auricles, right? The auricles are the external part of the atria. You guys saw these in the sheep heart that you looked at. And that kind of gives some kind of a little bit of an extension to the atria. They can fill up a little more because of these auricles. Okay, then we got the ventricles. These are the main pumping chambers, much thicker, much stronger. And then we have another septum here as well. So there's interventricular septum, right? So that wall of tissue between the right and the left ventricles. Some of you, when you cut into the sheep heart, yeah, it just says separate right and left on the bottom there. That's all it says. Separate right and left. When some of you cut into the sheep heart, did any of you just cut in and you didn't really find a chamber? You just found like more muscle? If you cut in the wrong spot, then you cut right into that septum instead of cutting into a chamber, right? And you kind of it gets a little bit confusing on where you're at. But that septum is just a wall of muscle there, right? So it's separating the two chambers. Okay, questions on that at all? Okay, well, we're going to talk about the valves next, and the valves are, at least the atrioventricular valves are connected to these papillary muscles that you guys saw in the sheep heart as well. So talk about this with the people on your team for a sec. And what do you think the purpose of those papillary muscles are in the heart? And then go ahead and decide on one of these answers and send it in. Go ahead.
Yeah.
If you're in the front two seats, turn around and check with the people behind you, see what they thought.
What does AB stand for?
Atrioventricular. Yeah, AV means the atrioventricular valve. So the tricuspid and the bicuspid valve.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Well, in the atrial contraction.
All right, go ahead and send that in here. Give you about 5 seconds. We've got a nice bell curve here, normal distribution of a bunch of people that aren't sure what the right answer is. But we're kind of nicely spread out there. Yeah, almost everybody's voted here. Has this ever happened to anybody when they're in a windy situation with an umbrella? How many people have had this happen to them? Yeah, for sure. Especially if your umbrella's kind of old, doesn't work that well. You get a big gust of wind up underneath it and it just flips your umbrella inside out like that, right? That's exactly what the papillary muscles do for the valves, right? Because what happens is this valve is open as the ventricle is filling. This is the mitral valve, right? So the mitral valve is the one between the left atrium and the left ventricle. Okay, so blood just came back from the lungs, went into the left atrium, right? And now it's just going down into the left ventricle. It's not typically like we don't just fill up the atria first and then pump it down to the ventricle. That valve's actually just open, right? So blood's just coming from the lungs, going through that valve, filling up the left ventricle. We don't actually close this valve until the ventricle contracts. And what happens when it contracts is it slams the blood up underneath that valve, okay? And if we don't have strong force pulling that valve downwards, then the valve would just turn inside out like that, right? And the blood would go back up into the left atrium instead of out the aorta, right? And so that's really what those papillary muscles do. When we contract, blood slams up underneath the valve and the papillary muscles hold it down so the umbrella doesn't turn inside out, right? And so that is, which answer is that actually? Is that prevent the AV valves from turning inside out? Yeah, this one here. So that was what 40%, well, actually, no, that was what 33% of you put, a third of you said that. So questions on that? Go ahead, Eric.
So where's the bicuspid valve? Is that like what's there?
That is the bicuspid valve. Yeah. So the mitral valve is also known as the bicuspid valve. Yeah. Good question. Yeah. So tricuspid valves between the right atrium and right ventricle, bicuspid is between the left. But in clinical settings, it's pretty much always going to be called the mitral valve. Yeah. Good question. Other questions on that? Yeah, go ahead.
What's the difference between ventricles contracting?
Yeah, good question. So C versus D. Yeah, so C versus D. So when the atria contract before the ventricles contract, right? If we're thinking about an EKG, we'll see that later. We got a little P wave, then it goes for a bit, then we have this big QRS. The P wave is the atria contracting. And then we fill the ventricles the rest of the way, and then the ventricles contract. So when the atria contract, we want this valve to stay open, right? Because that's pushing the blood through the rest of the way. And when the ventricles contract, we want this valve to close because we want the blood to go the other way through the aorta. So yeah, so it's all about making sure blood doesn't backflow into the atria when the ventricles contract. Yeah, does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. Other questions on that? Okay, so let's talk about these valves. All right, so we've got the valves that are between the atria and the ventricles, commonly known as the AV valves. Atrioventricular valves, right? So on the right side is the tricuspid, on the left side it's the bicuspid, which is also known as the mitral valve. Both have these chordae tendineae, both have valve flaps that are attached directly to those papillary muscles we were just talking about. Okay, and then we have the valves that are between the ventricles and whatever big artery those ventricles connect to. These are both called semilunar valves. They each have 3 cup-like structures. So one on the right side is a pulmonary semilunar valve. The one on the left side is the aortic semilunar valve. So the ones between the ventricles and their big vessels that they send blood to are the semilunar valves. The ones between the atria and the ventricles are the AV valves, also known as the bicuspid and tricuspid. Okay, so valves can have some pathologies to them, some problems. So one problem is stenosis. That's when the valve gets really stiff and it forces the ventricle, typically it's going to be on the semilunar valves, but it forces whatever whatever chamber is there to work harder to open it up. Okay. And so if you have aortic stenosis, the one that's connected to the aortic valve is the left ventricle. And if it's hard for the left ventricle to open up that valve, then that left ventricle is working extra hard all the time, which eventually can lead to heart failure on the left side of your heart. Okay, so that's one problem. That's when it's too stiff, too hard to open, but we can also have incompetent or insufficient valves which don't close all the way. So one problem is that it's hard to open them. The other problem is it's hard to close them. Okay, if it's hard to close them, then we have backflow, right? So if we go back to this image here, blood's supposed to hit this and nothing's supposed to get through. It's supposed to go over there to the aorta, but instead some squirts back into the atria. So some of that good oxygenated blood doesn't get pumped out to the body, right? So then the heart has to work harder to get the same amount of blood out to the body because it didn't get all the blood out that it was needing to. Right? So those are two potential issues with valves. Okay, questions on that? Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the function of valves, of these valves. Okay. And so when we look at the AV valves here, okay, AV valves here, and then semilunar valves over here. Okay. The bottom line with the AV valves is, like I was just talking about, blood is pretty much flowing through them as we're filling the ventricles. We don't fill the atria first and then send all that blood to the ventricles. They're just kind of open. Okay. So they close when we contract the ventricles. All right. So the key there is that we are preventing, so tricuspid, preventing backflow to the, if we're on tricuspid, it'll be the right side to the right atrium. Right. So we're in the right ventricle, trying to pump that blood out to the lungs. If the tricuspid is doing its job, then it's keeping that blood from going back up into the right atrium. Right? The bicuspid, same thing. Prevent backflow to left atrium. Okay. Now, when we think about our two semilunar valves, okay, we can talk about the aortic one first. So the aortic valve is connected to the left ventricle. We can see it, right? Well, we can't really see it that well there. But yeah, blood is going to come behind here and go out the aorta, right? So when the ventricle is contracting, it's opening up that valve, pushing all that blood out, blood's leaving the aorta. But then at some point when the ventricle isn't producing enough pressure, the blood just turns right back around and comes right back to the heart. Okay. And so that's when the aortic valve needs to close, because then it stops the blood from coming back into the heart. Right. So that aortic valve is prevents backflow from the aorta into the left ventricle. And the pulmonary valve is the same, just on the other side of the heart, right? So prevent backflow from pretty much from the lungs, but from that pulmonary trunk, from the pulmonary trunk or pulmonary arteries to the right ventricle. Okay, so the AV valves are making sure we don't send blood back into the previous ventricle that they just came from, or the previous atria they just came from, whereas these two semilunar valves are making sure blood doesn't get back into the heart after it left, right? Sending it out the aorta, we don't want it to come back. Sending it out the pulmonary trunk, we don't want it to come back. It's preventing those things. Okay. Questions on that? Any questions on what I wrote?
Just
Of
clarification.
course.
Valves
Yeah.
to prevent your backflow.
The valves themselves don't contract, but those papillary muscles do, and they're attached to those chordae tendineae, which are attached to the valves. And so that holds the like leaflets of the valve down so they don't flap open. And then mhm. Yeah, they close when blood tries to come back to the heart. And that snaps them shut. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, listen. The last one under pulmonary? Sure. Yeah, it says prevent backflow from the pulmonary trunk, pretty much that the pulmonary arteries that backflow will be coming back to the right ventricle if it came back, right? Yeah. Other questions on that? Okay. All right. So let's go ahead and we can just kind of walk through this one together here. So we've got this is just a different view of the valves, looking at the valves this way, right? So kind of like from the very top of the heart, looking down on those big vessels, as well as this would be like the top of the heart got cut off, like the atria aren't there. Okay, so the one there would be the mitral valve. You can see the two leaflets to it. All right, and then we can see B, which is the tricuspid, right? We can see the three different parts to it there. And then C and D both have three little cup-like structures, right? Aortic valve and the pulmonary valve. In this, you can kind of see that hole between the right atria and the left atria. It's called the fossa ovalis there, but the foramen ovale is the other name for it. Okay, and the answer to that clicker question, the one that right here, yeah, which valve is between the right atrium and the right ventricle? Yeah, so right atrium, right ventricle, that would be our tricuspid, right? Which was number what? Well, that was B, right? Yeah, that was B. Okay. Questions on these valves at all? Okay. We good? Need some more time? All right. Okay, so you guys have been looking at the coronary blood vessels in the human heart model in lab. And so obviously the muscle of the heart itself needs a lot of blood. Okay, even though its job is to pump blood, it also needs blood to supply the muscle tissue to be able to contract. Okay. And the myocardium is too thick to get oxygen from the inside of the chamber all the way out to where it needs to get. All right. So we have to have special blood vessels that feed the heart muscle. Okay. And so right here is the aorta, right? So this would be like left ventricle pumping the blood up that way. You don't normally see the right and left coronary artery there because it's kind of buried in the heart tissue. But if you take that off, you can see that the heart is actually the first thing to get blood, right? The right and left coronary arteries are right there. So the first thing to receive blood from the heart is the heart. Okay. So very early branch there for the right and left coronary arteries. And then to get the blood back, there's these big coronary veins that go into a coronary sinus, which is this big flattened vein that can kind of fill up when it needs to and then smash down when the heart pumps, and that kind of helps to clear it out. So pathologies with the coronary arteries are those little things got messed up there, so I'll just take them off. But angina is chest pain, right? So chest pain, and that results from a temporary blockage or partial blockage of one of these coronary arteries. Okay, and that leads to pain, leads to lack of oxygen to the blood or to the heart, and leads to pain. And so people that struggle with angina commonly take nitroglycerin. Nitroglycerin is a synthetic form of that chemical we talked about before, nitric oxide, and that causes vasodilation. So it opens up the vessels in the heart, gets blood to the tissue that was not having blood in it before. Okay, so that's a temporary or partial blockage. It doesn't actually result in death of tissue, but it just results in pain. But if somebody has a heart attack, a full-on what's called myocardial infarction, this means that we have a complete blockage of an artery. All the tissue beyond that artery dies. And this is a heart attack. This is the #1 leading cause of death in our country. Every 40 minutes, or sorry, 40 seconds, someone in our country dies of a heart attack. And so over the course of this class period, that's, over 100 people died of a heart attack in our country. So this is, we'll get into it more in the end of the class. As far as kind of some of the physiology of it, but yeah, so the bottom line is they get atherosclerosis. Okay, and that atherosclerosis is a hardening of the arteries. And then eventually that leads to a blood clot being formed. And then the blood clot can completely block the flow of blood. Treatment for this would be to either go up in there, in through the femoral artery, find your way all the way up into where the heart is. And then they put a little stent in there. There's a picture of the stent on the next side. That's something that just opens up the artery that was blocked, or a bypass surgery where you actually take a vein from somewhere else, plug it into an artery on the part that's still good, not blocked, go around the part that's blocked and plug it in to where it's open again. So you're just literally skipping the blocked part. And so that both of that is shown here. So this is a CABG surgery, right, which is coronary artery bypass graft. Right, so taking a blood vessel from somewhere else, plugging it into a large blood vessel, and then skipping the part of the heart that was blocked, and so we can still supply blood to that area. This is what a stent looks like. Put this little like mesh screen thing in, and then it opens up and just opens up that narrowed artery and allows for blood flow to continue. Okay. Questions on that? Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about the kind of microanatomy of cardiac muscle cells first. Okay, and so cardiac tissue is striated, which is like skeletal muscle. It has stripes. That's really what that means. Okay, the fibers are branched, which is different than skeletal muscle. They kind of branch off themselves and then connect to other fibers. Each of the cells just have one nucleus, which was different than skeletal muscle as well, right? Skeletal muscle cells have lots of nuclei, but they're heavy with mitochondria, lots of mitochondria, about 30% of the volume of the cell, whereas in skeletal muscle, it's about 2%. So heavy mitochondria, which makes it so these cells never get tired, right? Which is exactly what we want. We don't want our heart to get tired. Okay, and then we have a unique setup in cardiac muscle cells here, where the cells are all connected to each other. And the places where those cells connect are called intercalated discs. And there's multiple structures in those discs. One of those is desmosomes. Okay? Desmosomes are like little rivets that hold the muscle cells together. We have gap junctions. We talked about these last semester. Gap junctions allow for, they're holes between the cells, right? It allows for ions to pass from one cell to the next. So we can have an action potential going from one cell to the next without starting a new signal. Okay, so then when our cells are acting in unison like that, because of those gap junctions, the term for that is called functional syncytium. And so that just means all the fibers within a chamber. So like the left ventricle, all the fibers in the left ventricle act as a single unit and they all contract together. So we can get a nice forceful pump out of that. All the fibers in the right ventricle act together, all the fibers in the right atrium, left atrium, each of those chambers, they act as one unit. And then lastly, cardiac muscle cells are involuntary, right? We can't think about contracting our heart and do it, right? Luckily, we don't have to think about it. It just happens all the time without our control. And so it's part of the autonomic nervous system as well as hormones controlling the heart rate. Okay, next slide. I'll leave this up here for a sec, but the next slide has some labeling all of those structures. So go ahead and start labeling that with your team. And there's a clicker question there for you to answer as well.
Oh, wait. Yeah, is the gap is as a channel. Actually, wait, I don't know what he is. Yeah, this one.
These like because the desmosomes are like tiny. Like I remember numbers like that, I think.
Oh. Wait.
It's not soon.
No, I think I want to play I think it's in.
All right, go ahead and send in your answer there. Make sure to hit the send button. Anybody else? Go ahead and hit send. There's about 6 more of you, I think. It's actually a throwback from last semester when we talked about skeletal muscle. It's not a structure that's on the previous slide. Anybody else? I'll leave it open for a sec. Just hit send. I think there's still 3 of you that haven't sent it in. Most of you said A. That's the most common answer there. Let's see. Yep. So let's walk through these. So A is the gap junctions. Okay. So these are the holes between the cells that allow for action potentials to connect from one cell to the next. Okay. Which is different than action potentials to dive deep into a thick cell like a cardiac muscle cell. Okay. B is those desmosomes that hold the cells together under high stress. Okay. C, what do you guys think C was? Mitochondria, yep, bunch of mitochondria there for sure. D is just the nucleus. And then we've got E. Anybody know what E is? T tubules. That's the answer to this question, right? Muscle cells are very thick. And so if we just leave the action potentials like on the top or on the outside of the cell, it doesn't get in to stimulate enough of the sarcoplasmic reticulums that are there that are holding calcium for us. We need a structure to help us go deep into the cell. That's what those T tubules do for us. Okay. And then F is the sarcoplasmic reticulum. This is where we store calcium to be released during muscle contraction. Okay. Then we go to G, which is just the membrane of the muscle cell, but it's a special membrane called the sarcolemma, but it's just a cell membrane. And then H is that intercalated disc that we kind of we're zooming in on over here. All right. Questions about any of these? Okay. Looks like most people are done writing. All right, so we'll just kind of do a quick review of the pathway of blood flow through the heart and the body. You guys have done this in lab, but we can just kind of talk it through here. So we've got blood circulating through. One is kind of the general circulation. So going through the vascular system, the general circulation, capillary beds at our tissues, down below our heart, above our heart, right? And then all of that blood is going to come back into the right ventricle, or sorry, right atrium via the vena cava, right? Superior and inferior vena cava. Okay, those are both dumping into the right atrium. That right atrium is going to then, it's going to then let the blood go into the right ventricle next, right? So right atrium is 2, right ventricle 3. Okay, and then that right ventricle pumps the blood out of the pulmonary trunk, splits into the pulmonary arteries, goes out to the lungs, right? So we see the blood going through the pulmonary capillaries where it gets filled up with oxygen, right? It goes from red, or it goes from blue to red, right? Turns red here because we're filling it up with oxygen. And then it's going to go back in to the heart via the pulmonary veins, right? So we see those pulmonary veins. Those pulmonary veins are here, dumping blood into the left atrium. Okay. And then from the left atrium, we go down into the left ventricle. We can see it there. That left ventricle contracts, pushes blood out the aorta right here, and now back out to the general circulation. So then the oxygen can be extracted, right? We remove oxygen there, and now the blood is blue again, right? Because it lost its oxygen. Okay, so hopefully that's mostly review from what you learned in lab already. But any questions on that? Yeah. As far as the just kind of general name of the circulation, yeah. So we have the pulmonary circuit, which is kind of what we'll talk about next right here. The pulmonary circuit is from the heart to the lungs and then back to the heart. And then systemic circuit, heart to the body and then back to the heart. And that's two. That's perfect. Yeah, perfect segue. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so the pulmonary circuit is really low pressure on that side. We don't have far to push the blood, right? And it's kind of got all the steps there. And then the systemic circuit is much higher pressure, much larger, thicker muscle in the left ventricle, because we got a lot further to push it, right? And a lot more gravity to deal with to get that blood where we need it to go, right? Yeah, and that's pretty much it. So I'll leave that up there for a sec. Oops. But yeah, we will see you guys on Friday. Have a great rest of your day.